Welcome to this evening's event, hosted by the International State Crime Initiative at Queen Mary, University of London. My name is Penny Green, and I'm chairing this evening. Before we move to Omar and his incredibly important talk, I want to start with an example of the kinds of threat that academic freedom is currently facing in the UK, and why what Omar is going to talk about is just so vital to what we do. You'll recall the brief blurb that we used to advertise Omar's talk, and I'll repeat it here for context. And it went, given Israel's siege and bombardment of Gaza, the question of challenging Western academic complicity with Israeli institutions that are directly complicit in the crimes of apartheid and genocide is more critical than ever. This talk addresses the importance Palestinians have attached to non-violent forms of solidarity in their struggle for freedom, justice, and equality. Many of you, but perhaps not all of you, know that as a result of this statement, our event was actually deplatformed by Eventbrite. Why? Because they claim they have the discretion to remove any content that they determine violates their community guidelines or terms of service. This includes, they said, all forms of discrimination and hatred rooted in anti-Semitism. Our own university at Queen Mary refused to advertise the event on its social media channels because they'd been advised by the university's central social media team to approach the subject with caution, not wanting to open the school's social media accounts up to any social media trolling or disagreements that the marketing team wouldn't be best placed to reply on. I wonder if this message went out over Ukrainian events. But this is merely symptomatic of what is happening to academic freedom across the country. Academics and students who've spoken out against genocide and war crimes and in solidarity with besieged Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank have been subject to threatening responses online, in the news media, and in some cases have been confronted with disciplinary or even legal action. Several academics and students have received threatening communications, including death threats. There's been a real surge in reports of campus events being cancelled, academics being harassed in the media, and student societies being shut down over statements to do with Gaza. But I'm delighted that you are all here nonetheless, and we will continue to resist the chilling effect that Israel's genocide of the Palestinian people is having on Palestinian solidarity in this country. So it's an absolutely huge privilege to welcome Omar Barghouti this evening, joining us from the occupied West Bank. Omar Barghouti is a Palestinian human rights defender and co-founder of the Palestinian-led BDS movement for Palestinian rights. He is a co-recipient of the 2017 Gandhi Peace Award, and he holds a bachelor's and a master's degree in electrical engineering from Columbia University, New York, and is currently pursuing a PhD in philosophy at the University of Amsterdam. His commentaries and views have appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, The Washington Post, among many others. And his book, BDS, The Global Struggle for Palestinian Rights, was published by Haymarket in 2011. Omar will speak for around 20 to 30 minutes, giving plenty of time for him to address your questions. Your questions will be taken through the chat, so please use the chat as and when you have a question, and my colleague Tom McManus from the International State Crime Initiative will be monitoring and asking those questions after Omar has finished his talk. I want first to thank Gulshanara Khatun, as always, who manages these events so beautifully. Thank you, Gulsh. And now I have the huge pleasure of handing over to Omar Barghouti. Omar, please.
Thanks a lot, Penny. After days of being unable to hear his voice, 2 days ago, I finally received a voice note from my dear friend, a professor of comparative literature and decolonial studies in Gaza. An eternal revolutionary optimist, as he is, his voice this time was different. After some prodding from me on voice notes, he admitted that he, his wife, his 2 young daughters, and all the other relatives sharing their apartment have begun to go hungry and thirsty with the only water available unfit for human consumption. A few days ago, UN experts warned Gaza is, quote, running out of time, warning of an impending genocide. What they meant to say is that due to Israel's indiscriminate carpet bombing of all means of life and its complete siege of this modern-day ghetto, the 2.3 million Palestinians trapped in Gaza are running out of life. Senior UN official Craig Mokhaybar wrote days before leaving his post, quote, "This is a textbook case of genocide. The European ethno-nationalist settler colonial project in Palestine has entered its final phase toward the expedited destruction of the last remnants of indigenous Palestinian life in Palestine. What's more, the governments of the United States, the United Kingdom, and much of Europe," he said, "are wholly complicit in the horrific assault. Not only are these governments refusing to meet their treaty obligations to ensure respect for the Geneva Conventions, but they are in fact actively arming the assault, providing economic and intelligence support, and giving political and diplomatic cover for Israel's atrocities." End of quote. On October 13th, prominent Israeli scholar of the Holocaust and genocide studies, Professor Raz Segal, was the first to describe Israel's aggression in Gaza as, quote, "a textbook case of genocide." Following that, over 880 international scholars, as well as leading US and Palestinian human rights organizations and UN experts, have also warned of an unfolding genocide in Gaza. As international law experts would know, in genocide jurisprudence, one needs to prove the intent, which must be pondered against reality and capacity. I shall just cite a few examples of what genocide scholars, many of them agree, are considered irrefutable expressions of intent. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, for example, said, quote, "You must remember what Amalek has done to you, says our Holy Bible," end of quote. He's referring to Samuel 15:3, which says, quote, "Now go and smite Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass," end of quote. In another statement, Netanyahu said, "We are the children of light. They are the children of darkness, and the light will defeat the dark," end of quote. Israeli War Minister Yoav Gallant infamously called Palestinians in Gaza, quote, "human animals," prompting Jewish Voice for Peace in the US, a progressive BDS supporting partner, to say, quote, "As Jews, we know what happens when people are called animals. We can and we must stop this. Never again means never again for anyone," end of quote. They later said, "Never again is now." On October 25th, a prominent Israeli newspaper revealed an Israeli plan to ethnically cleanse Palestinians from Gaza to the Sinai Desert in Egypt. It's produced by the Office of the Israeli Minister of Intelligence. In the same vein, Likud member of the Knesset, Ariel Kalner, wished for Gaza, quote, "a Nakba that will overshadow the Nakba of 1948, referring to the planned ethnic cleansing of the majority of indigenous Palestinians in 48. Most recently, a group of influential Israeli rabbis wrote a letter to Benjamin Netanyahu affirming Israel's right under Jewish law, as they claim, to bomb Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza, the largest hospital in Gaza, repeating the unfounded claim that it's being used as, quote, "a human shield." A few days later, and using the same fabrication, the same logic, close to 90 Israeli doctors, physicians, called for bombing all Palestinian hospitals in Gaza, claiming that, quote, "the residents of Gaza have brought their annihilation upon themselves," end of quote. Calls to flatten Gaza, turn it into a parking lot, to exterminate its residents, or to merely ethnically cleanse them entirely have become mainstream in Israel, from political leaders, military, security, academic, cultural, media leaders. Same language. An unprecedented dehumanization of Palestinians prevails today in Israeli society, enabling this unfolding genocide in Gaza. On the 5th of November, just 2 days ago, Israel's Minister of Heritage from the Jewish Power Party, Amichai Eliyahu, in an interview with Israeli radio, went as far as suggesting dropping a nuclear bomb on Gaza, where 2.3 million Palestinians are trapped under Israeli occupation and total siege. As veteran Israeli journalist Yossi Melman reacted, quote, Eliyahu destroyed 60 years of Israel's nuclear ambiguity, end of quote. His statement actually adds to the irrefutable evidence of Israeli leaders' intent to commit genocide in Gaza. But even without a nuclear bomb, Israel has already bombed Gaza with the destructive power equivalent to 2 nuclear bombs of the size dropped by the US on Hiroshima during World War II. 2 nuclear bombs. Israel's numerous war crimes and crimes against humanity have included indiscriminate bombing, ethnic cleansing, the denial of humanitarian aid, the illegal use of explosive weapons and white phosphorus against civilians. By cutting off water, food, medicine, and fuel, Israel, the UN is warning, may cause many, many children to dehydrate to death as clean water runs out. In fact, Israel is employing, quote, starvation as a weapon of war, as affirmed by Oxfam and Palestinian human rights organizations. As a direct result, since October 7th, the Israeli occupation forces have murdered over 10,300 Palestinians in Gaza, including more than 4,200 children. 4,200 children, with another horrific massacre happening almost every hour. Israel has killed more civilians in Gaza in 30 days than Russia has in its entire war in Ukraine, which began more than 600 days ago. But this gory timeline of life and death, whether fast or slow death, did not begin with the Palestinian armed groups' attack on Israeli military bases and settlements around Gaza on October 7th, during which hundreds of Israeli civilians and soldiers were killed. Where you start the timeline in any situation of oppression is a strong indicator of your moral compass. After 16 years of a near-total siege by Israel, designed to put the Palestinians on a diet, quote, but not to make them die of hunger, as one of the architects of this policy has admitted, Gaza was turned into an unlivable zone, according to the UN. The healthcare system was near collapse, 96% of the water was undrinkable, 60% of the children were anemic, and many suffered from stunted growth due to malnutrition. A generation of young Palestinians was psychologically scarred from the bombings and the siege. But this was all before. Now, Gaza is a site of unfolding genocide. Even someone like me, a Palestinian human rights defender who has for 4 decades experienced, documented, and peacefully resisted Israel's 75-year-old regime of settler colonialism and apartheid, cannot quite know how to deal with this televised genocide. The fact that it is televised is just as gruesome and unhuman as the fact that it is an impending genocide, for it points to a new level of complicity, the essential condition without which this carnage could not continue with impunity. On October 27th, however, at the UN General Assembly, 121 states voted for an immediate, durable, and sustained humanitarian truce. They couldn't say ceasefire because European countries were opposed strongly to that. So that was the compromise. Of course, the US, Israel, and a few other countries voted against, but the absolute majority voted for. This presented a political defeat for the US-Israel axis, which received 14 votes in total. despite the bullying and the propaganda. This vote, which was as much against Israel's genocide and US Western neocolonial hegemony and for justice and accountability, reflects the radical shift in global public opinion expressed in massive Palestine solidarity demonstrations, as in the UK especially, in so many statements from trade unions, academics, artists, Hollywood celebrities, athletes, academic associations and departments, among others. It also reflects growing concerns in the West about business interests with Arab and Muslim majority countries, as clearly reflected in the Financial Times editorial not too long ago. All this has further isolated the hegemonic Western axis, thus liberating the minds of millions worldwide from the fear of daring to defy the genocidal dictates of the self-proclaimed masters of the universe. Much of the Western establishment has duly accepted Israel's claim that Palestinian armed groups' attack on October 7th was unprovoked and has unquestionably endorsed Israel's claim to self-defense. At this time of herd-like polarization and knee-jerk anti-Palestinian racism, ethical principles tend to be overlooked. Allow me to share 5 points based on my ethical perspective on this. First, calling the Palestinian group's attack unprovoked is not only unethical, it's a typical colonial and racist trope that views Palestinians as relative humans who do not deserve full human rights. As the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire writes, quote, "With the establishment of a relationship of oppression, violence has already begun. Never in history has violence been initiated by the oppressed. Violence is initiated by those who oppress, who exploit, who fail to recognize others as persons, not by those who are oppressed, exploited, and unrecognized." End of quote. So the reaction of the oppressed, whether one considers any aspect of it morally or legally justifiable or not, is always just that, a reaction to the initial violence of the oppressor. Understanding the context and causes of resistance does not entail at all accepting its specific tactics. Even the patently cautious UN Secretary General, in his recent address to the Security Council, recognized that the recent crisis, quote, "did not happen in a vacuum," end of quote. Second, Israel's far-right government, its most racist, fundamentalist, sexist, homophobic ever, has been ruthlessly escalating its ethnic cleansing, siege, pogroms, killings, incarceration, and daily humiliation of millions of Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory, including Jerusalem, in the Negev, and elsewhere. Israel thought that its unmasked brutality could force us Palestinians to surrender and accept oppression as fate. Third, as affirmed by the International Court of Justice in 2004 and by the South African government just recently, quote, "Under the laws of occupation," the South African government said in a statement, "under the laws of occupation, Israel does not have the right to defend itself using military means against the Palestinians under its occupation, as Israel is an occupying power," end of quote. Aside from that, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide does not allow for any justification whatsoever to perpetrate genocidal acts. Genocide cannot be undertaken as reprisal for or retaliation to unlawful acts, no matter how serious. International law actually recognizes the right of all peoples resisting foreign occupation and colonization to resort to armed struggle. However, the use of force against civilians is strictly prohibited, whether from the colonizer or the colonized side, despite the massive power asymmetry and the just as massive moral asymmetry between the two. Fourth, condemning any illegal or immoral act of violence that the oppressed may commit in resisting oppression in an inherently asymmetric relationship of power is acceptable only if the condemning party has earned the moral standing to do so by being already on record condemning the system of colonial oppression that has been for decades the root cause of violence. Fifth, since oppression is the root cause of violence, those of us who sincerely care about ending all violence, the initial ongoing violence of the oppressor and the reactive resistance of the oppressed, must act to end oppression. As the struggle that ended apartheid in South Africa has shown, ending state, corporate, and institutional complicity in Israel's system of oppression, especially through the nonviolent tactics of BDS, is the most effective and ethical way to stand in solidarity. The BDS movement was launched in 2005 by the absolute majority in Palestinian society, in historic Palestine as well as in exile. It calls for ending Israel's 1967 military occupation, dismantling its system of racial domination, which meets the UN definition of apartheid, and respecting the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their lands and to receive reparations as stipulated in international law. Anchored in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the BDS movement categorically opposes all forms of racism, including Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. BDS targets complicity, not identity. Over the last 18 years, BDS has won global support from trade unions, farmers' coalitions, as well as racial, social, gender, and climate justice movements, together representing tens of millions of people around the world. It has compelled large multinationals to end their involvement in Israel's human rights violations. Veolia, G4S, CRH, and many, many other companies had to leave the Israeli market under BDS pressure. BDS has also played a key role in the decisions by large sovereign funds and major US churches to divest from complicit companies and Israeli banks. Ending international complicity in Israel's regime of oppression would not only serve the struggle for Palestinian liberation, it would also serve global struggles for racial, economic, social, gender, and climate justice as well. Israel, after all, is a key partner of far-right groups in the West, most of whom are anti-Semitic to the core, and of authoritarian and despotic regimes, from India to Myanmar, the United Arab Emirates to several African dictatorships. Israel sells its military security technologies, including spyware like Pegasus, as battle-tested, of course, on us. Aside from fighting the dehumanizing propaganda, which is one of the two legs on which Israel's unfolding genocide stands, Palestinians are calling for solidarity, not charity. A necessary prerequisite for solidarity is ending complicity, doing no harm. In the time of genocide, this is the most profound ethical obligation everyone has, particularly if you are citizens of quasi-democratic Western states like yours that are partners in crime, no less. As a human rights defender, not a legal expert, I've always considered ex iniuria jus non oritur, a key principle of international law, according to which acts contrary to the law cannot become a source of legal rights for a wrongdoer. This common sense principle that unjust acts could not create law or right is the antithesis of might makes right. But might, before our eyes, is corrupting, co-opting, and making many otherwise knowledgeable, even liberal, educators, artists, journalists, writers, workers, legal experts, medical professionals, among others, succumb to the hegemonic Western herd mentality, parroting propaganda, racist lies, and producing all sorts of justifications that enable the mighty white colonial oppressor again to perpetrate yet another genocide against yet another racialized, colonized, and oppressed indigenous people. This does not bode well, not just for Palestinians, but for humanity at large. Do no harm. If you or your universities have relations with complicit Israeli universities or cultural institutions, if your trade union, institution, or city council procures from or invests in companies and banks that enable Israeli apartheid, if you buy products of such companies, or if you are part of a music band or sports team that plans to play Tel Aviv, in all these cases, you're in a way involved in doing harm, in complicity. And you need to work to end that as a fulfillment of your profound moral obligation. If you hate violence, end oppression. If you hate oppression, end complicity. If you love freedom, justice, dignity, and equality for all, irrespective of identity, as we do, mobilize pressure to help us dismantle Israel's regime of settler colonialism and apartheid, as well as all other forms of oppression. But for now, we need you urgently. We need your support urgently to help stop the Gaza genocide. Every day, I dread powering on my phone and checking my messages as I expect the worst. I dread not hearing from my friend in Gaza, but I know when I share with him the many efforts worldwide to end complicity, to push for an immediate ceasefire, to lift the siege, to dismantle apartheid, to achieve justice, he gets so empowered and becomes hopeful again that the world has not forgotten them. Don't kill that hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Omar, for an incredibly powerful talk and an incredibly powerful call for action and based around very strong ethical principles. Before we go to the questions that emerged from the chat, I'd like to ask you a question about what's going on in the West Bank. I mean, as you said, this is a genocide that we are witnessing on our phones, on our television screens, and explicitly from Gaza. We hear almost nothing unless we're particularly tuned into certain people. We're hearing nothing about the West Bank. And we know that the violence and the land grabbing has been ramped up under the cover of what is happening in Gaza. And we also know that this is a genocide not only against the Gazans, but against the Palestinians as a whole people. A genocide which arguably began in 2017 with the Balfour Declaration. So I wonder, Omar, could you give us a sense, it's a two-part question really, a sense of what is happening in the West Bank so our listeners, our viewers can learn something, but also about what kind of successes BDS has had in the West Bank and in relation to the illegal settlements.
Yes, thanks, Penny, for that, because Palestinians, the millions of Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, feel kind of guilty. I know from many colleagues and friends, they feel guilty to talk about the oppression that is escalating beyond anything we've seen in in decades. We have not seen this level of lawless, wanton, willful killing, torture, destruction, land grab, piecemeal ethnic cleansing, pushing communities off their land. Settlers, just the other day, a colleague of mine has family in Masafer Yatta in the south near Hebron. And he said his relatives, distant relatives, live in a cave because they couldn't build anywhere. The land, they're not allowed to, they no permit to build. They live in a cave, literally. An armed settler goes into the cave, starts destroying everything they have, and they have so little. He destroyed everything. And the whole family just bundled together, watching him in fear. They couldn't do anything because he's armed and he could just easily shoot them and no one would care. They're killing hundreds of Palestinians in Gaza. You think anyone would care if they shoot yet another man, woman, and 3 children in a cave in Masafer Yatta? So that is the fear, that is the everyday life of Palestinians in the West Bank. Settlers are just going around kidnapping people, torturing them, and showing it on video. They're recording it and showing it, and it has become an entertainment kind of business for many, many Israelis. They laugh at it, they show it on mainstream media, how they strip Palestinians naked, torture them, put their cigarettes on the, really horrible images, very similar to what the American occupation forces did in Abu Ghraib in Iraq. Very, very similar images, and it's all videotaped. It's all streamlined. So they're not ashamed. And they're not just settlers. Many, many soldiers in their uniform are involved in this. And again, it's on videos for the whole world to see, and it's entertainment for them. This level of not just cruelty, but total, complete dehumanization is the same that we're seeing employed to justify and enable the genocide in Gaza. So the level of violence is obviously much, much, much lower in the West Bank, but compared to where it was before October 7th, it's so much higher and it's so lawless. Going back to the second point about BDS successes in the West Bank, I would say very comfortably that BDS has wall-to-wall support. It has a near consensus in Palestinian society. Women's unions, trade unions, farmers' unions, students, youth, just about everyone, just about every main organization is part of the BDS movement, minus the tiny, tiny minority whose interests are connected to the occupation and benefit from the occupation. Like in every colonial situation, you always have a tiny minority that is connected to the colonizers, but the absolute majority are connected to BDS. For example, organic campaigns to boycott many products of the occupation. Many companies Israeli companies that are involved in the occupation, those campaigns have grown tremendously. Teachers, universities, everyone is mobilizing to up the ante for BDS campaigns, and most importantly, calling on their colleagues worldwide. So Palestinian academics have reiterated their calls on academics worldwide to help us, issuing statements. Now is the time to boycott Israeli academic institutions because they're deeply involved. They're a pillar in designing, implementing, justifying, and whitewashing Israel's entire regime of settler colonialism and apartheid.
Well, thank you very much, Omar. I'm going to hand over to Tom now to ask some of the questions that have been raised in the chat. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Penny, and thank you, Omar. So the first question that has come in on our Q&A is, if this is a textbook example of genocide and every massacre is almost live on TV and social media platforms, how can we stop the ongoing genocide? How can syndicates, parliaments, and NGOs in the countries providing weapons to Israel help?
There's so many ways to help, and thanks so much for this question, especially in a country like the UK. Clearly, the government is a partner in crime. They're still arming Israel. They still oppose ceasefire now. We're seeing thousands upon hundreds of thousands in the streets, in England, in Scotland, in Wales, everywhere. We're seeing them in Ireland, everywhere. We're seeing people coming out and saying, ceasefire now. Then we'll address the root causes of this injustice. But for now, so many in the UK are calling for ceasefire now, but the government does not care. The head of the opposition party does not care. Just as immoral, just as anti-Palestinian, just as racist, and just as imperialist. They care about the interests of the weapons companies and appeasing the US master much more than caring about human rights and decency. Stopping arms shipments to a country that is committing horrific war crimes and crimes against humanity and possibly genocide is just a no-brainer. It should be a very simple ask, but your government is not doing it. So this requires massive pressure on members of parliament, on political parties, including the opposition party, which is in bed with government in enabling genocide. And I'll say it very openly. Labour leadership is enabling genocide with its rhetoric, ignoring what's happening and not even calling for a ceasefire until now. What does it take? After 4,300 Palestinian children were murdered, what else do you need to call for a ceasefire? Let alone dismantling apartheid, God forbid. Just ceasefire now. So clearly we need to pressure more, because those Western democracies are really becoming a thing of the past. They're much more authoritative. Political parties are authoritative, very anti-democratic. And again, this is a warning. If they get away with this, no one is safe. If they get away with ignoring public opinion on Palestine, on a televised genocide, who is safe? Black Lives Matter, trade unions, the women's movement, no one is safe. They'll come for you. So it's very important now to unite, to get the message across to government. You must immediately impose a ceasefire and stop the arms trade with Israel. Disrupting the arms trade is another issue. Labor unions in Belgium, for example, 3 labor unions that represent dock workers and airport workers decided they will not ship weapons through their ports and airports to Israel. They will not handle weapons going to Israel through Belgium. Usually US weapons go through the UK, Belgium, Spain, Portugal, several other countries. So trade unions can also help with that. So escalating boycotts, escalating divestment by universities, by city councils, and so on, and actual direct action that is peaceful can also help to make this government listen to what the majority in the public are saying.
Thank you. And I've been texted a few questions as well. I understand that Israel has a whole department devoted to combating BDS. Could you say something about this, what it represents and how it has impacted on the BDS movement?
Sure. They claim that they had a department. I mean, it was a whole ministry for several years, 2015, 2016, dedicated entirely to fighting BDS. And it stayed on until a couple of years ago. They disbanded it because it was a complete flop. It was a failure. Far from ending BDS, it couldn't even slow down our acceleration. The movement kept growing and growing and growing into the mainstream, winning much more power at the grassroots level, people power, that is, so that ministry failed completely, but not for lack of trying. As revealed in the Israeli media in 2014, the Netanyahu government, and he was prime minister then, decided in their cabinet meeting to fight BDS through using the intelligence services, that is Mossad, Shabak, military intelligence, to, quote, sabotage the movement from within and without. And there are many, many details that we can go into how they've tried to do this. Part of it is smearing, part of it is weaponized, fabricated smears of anti-Semitism used against even Jewish supporters of BDS. Today, they call them anti-Semites, as I'm sure you know in the UK. Using also massive propaganda campaigns to work with the intelligence campaigns, using lawfare or legal warfare, which means that filing lawsuits for absolutely nothing against everyone they can get hold of, just to distract that person and make their life miserable. So that if you're an academic and you get sued for saying something that they're claiming is racist, and you have to fight it off and get the UCU to fight for you and so on, it takes months and legal fees and so on. By the end of the battle, you win, most likely, because it's fabricated, bogus claims. But you feel, do I really want to go again into this and speak out about Palestine? That's how the chilling effect works. So Israel, through this ministry, anti-BDS ministry, for years, fought BDS with all these tools. It has been revealed in The Nation. There was an article that revealed, in fact, Israel invested hundreds of millions of dollars, and its lobby groups in the US, hundreds of millions of dollars more in fighting BDS over the years. Hundreds of millions of dollars for fighting this movement, non-violent, human rights abiding movement. So that's the level of repression. Many of us activists were subjected to really terrible repression, and Israel exported its repressive tactics, its McCarthyite tactics, to Western anti-Palestinian governments like the UK government, so that they outsourced repression even to the UK government, US government, obviously. Tens of state legislatures in the US have adopted anti-BDS legislation, which is totally McCarthyite, completely draconian.
Thank you. I have a question asking about specific examples of the successes of BDS. Can you talk about specific examples of successes?
Okay, I mentioned some in my talk, but I'll repeat them, but there's so many. It would take a very long time. But just very recently, G4S, which is a British company, the largest security company in the world, was forced to abandon the Israeli market completely. It sold its business entirely in Israel after several years. That has cost G4S massive contracts, as well as reputational damage, as even the Financial Times at one point said. BDS has caused G4S reputational damage, which translates to money. Veolia, a French conglomerate, lost over a 7-year BDS campaign, over $20 billion with a B, and finally left the Israeli market in 2015. Orange Telecommunications, another massive French company, again was threatened with a boycott by BDS Egypt, where it had some 30 million customers, whereas in Israel it had 1.5 million at the time, but it was involved in settlement business, clear violation of international law, so it was threatened with a BDS boycott, and within months it walked out. It left the Israeli market. So BDS has had a lot of successes with companies really compelling them to abandon their illegal projects with Israel. Sovereign funds, like the Norwegian Sovereign Fund, the largest in the world, and in the Netherlands, and in New Zealand, and several church funds in the US, which are quite big. Many of these funds, our partners in the BDS movement, including some faith communities, including progressive Jewish groups, including trade unions, especially in Norway, played a critical role in getting those pension funds, sovereign funds, investment funds to divest from companies and banks involved in the occupation, in the illegal settlements, and so on. At the academic and cultural level, just now, you see tens of thousands of artists coming out supporting the boycott, or at least calling for ceasefire, calling for justice, at the very least. We've seen statements by tens and tens of Hollywood figures coming out and saying, ceasefire now, Biden should immediately impose a ceasefire. They also mentioned justice. They also mentioned the root causes of the situation that we're in. Of course, they reject any harming of civilians, as we do. That's a morally consistent position that we take as well. But when you see the ivory tower of Hollywood starting to talk justice, you know something is changing. And the thousands of writers and installation artists, and there's so much happening with the trade union movement and so on, universities, academics, thousands joining the boycott. So it's really, really growing. So academic, cultural, sports, economic boycotts, divestment are really growing, even beginning of sanctions, I would say.
Thank you. I have a question from an audience member. Why do people want to march? Why do people want to march on Remembrance Day weekend in the UK, disrespecting our country?
No one wants to disrespect any memory or any heritage in the UK. It's just inconvenient that we're undergoing genocide, you know? It's a bit more important because it's current genocide. It's current. And your state, your government is involved to its knees. It's arming Israel while it's committing genocide. So excuse us, excuse the Solidarity Movement for not picking the date. It was forced on us because we're facing a genocide that we're trying to stop. If you help us, if you demonstrate with us, or write to your MP, or push your union, or push your association, wherever you might be, to push government to adopt a ceasefire now, you'll help us bring this genocide to an end very soon. And we promise you, we won't need to have those mass demonstrations just to stop the war. Then we'll have demonstrations calling for ending apartheid, settler colonialism, but then we would avoid days that are so important because no one wants to desecrate any sacred memory of anyone. We do respect everyone's heritage, everyone's beliefs and everyone's memories. But believe me, we're facing genocide.
Thank you. What other forms of non-violent actions would you recommend?
Well, BDS is all nonviolent, so there's nothing that's different. So it's nonviolent action. All forms of nonviolent action are fine as long as they're within a certain strategy. They don't cause any undue harm to those participating. So, for example, when partners plan direct action, everyone may have seen Jewish Voice for Peace in the US doing this extremely impressive sit-in in Congress in the Grand Central Station in the middle of New York. Peaceful sit-in. It's an occupation, peaceful occupation of Grand Central Station. In Congress, there were thousands outside and hundreds inside. Many of them got arrested. And they're saying, not in our name, ceasefire now, stop the genocide. And it was extremely impressive, extremely inspiring, and it gave us a lot of hope. It gave Palestinians in Gaza a lot of hope. So direct action, when it's part of a strategy, when executed correctly, when everyone participating knows what risks they're taking and how to avoid, how to mitigate harm to those participating, then it's perfectly fine. Then it's something that we should all do. As I said, workers' unions in Belgium have disrupted the shipping of weapons to Israel. That's a very clear direct action form of solidarity that's extremely meaningful and effective.
Thank you. I'm just going to give people a chance to ask any more questions if they have them. I have one. Considering how long you've been involved in BDS and the movement, are you hopeful that this time, with some of the largest pro-Palestinian protests in history, we will see real change from world leaders who have supported Israel to this point?
Good question. I am relatively hopeful. I mean, given the situation, it's very difficult for a Palestinian to be hopeful. We're betrayed by international laws, the international law system, which was never international, completely Western dominated, but the hypocrisy is showing like never before. This unmasked, deeply ingrained, entrenched racism, colonial racism, is showing its ugly face from all these Western governments that are supposedly democratic. But there was an article by a trade unionist in Cambridge, who he's also a student, but he's a trade unionist. He wrote this beautiful article saying, "Thank you, Palestine, thank you, Gaza, because in mobilizing pressure on our government to stop its partnership in crime, to stop its complicity in genocide, we've reactivated our ability, we've empowered ourselves to fight for our other justice struggles as trade unions, as progressives, as anti-racist activists, and so on and so forth. We are discovering our power." When people saw themselves in the PSC, Palestine Solidarity Campaign demonstration a couple of weeks, 10 days ago, 500,000 on the streets, they felt that power. And it wasn't just about Palestine. Yes, it was about genocide, of course, but that same power can be channeled for other justice struggles, racial and climate and gender justice struggles just as well. So that empowers people when they feel that they can affect a real change. So I'm relatively hopeful, but at this moment, we've got to do everything possible in our power to stop this genocide. And the UK government is a very important piece of this genocidal puzzle.
Thank you. I'm just giving others a chance in case there are any more questions. Can you say something about the Palestinians who live in Israel and hold Israeli citizenship? What kind of position have they been put in now?
I am part of that community through marriage. My wife is a Palestinian citizen of present-day Israel, and we live in the Galilee. We live in the north. I'm not there now, but we live there. That's where our apartment is. It's become a total police state like never before. We asked my father-in-law even back in the 60s, when there were, since 1948 to 1966, Palestinians who became citizens, those who stood fast in the land after the massive ethnic cleansing of the Nakba in 1948, they eventually became citizens of Israel, but they were subjected to military law, a martial law by Israel until 1966, and then it was lifted. So we asked him, was it like that? The repression, the arrests for putting a like on a flag, Palestinian flag, with nothing else. You like it, they arrest you. You're at a job and you like something that says Free Palestine, you're fired. It's just the level of repression is unbelievable. Academics, nurses, doctors, students, little kids are getting punished for nothing, like never before. So it's becoming extremely repressive, very, very violent, vengeful mentality that has prevailed. Some of it very debased. I mean, dehumanizing Palestinians to an extremely dangerous level. So as Penny was saying earlier, yes, the actual acts of genocide are happening in Gaza, but the intent of genocide against all Palestinians is one and the same. And those part of the Palestinian people who are citizens of Israel are still considered part of that dehumanized relative humans who are the enemy kind of indigenous people. Very similar to the European experience in North America, not the scale, but the mentality that the indigenous are dangerous because they assert a right to their land. And how can we have that? You can't have a settler colony when the indigenous are asserting any rights. They just have to disappear or die or just be transferred, ethnically cleansed. So many Palestinians who are citizens of present-day Israel today feel the real danger of ethnic cleansing because of the level of repression and complete silencing and censorship.
Thank you. We don't have any more open questions from participants in the chat, unless anybody wants to type in anything now. I was just wondering, Omar, if you could tell us, people who have watched this will now be thinking that there are many ways that they themselves can get involved in BDS, whether it's looking at the companies which are involved or going to their local boroughs or councils who invest their pension funds and all the rest in Israeli companies and Israeli investment opportunities. Where is there a good one-stop shop, or where's the best place to go for people to find out these lists of companies, or where the pressure points are?
Okay, BDS is about being strategic and ethical. We always talk about the golden balance between having ethical principles and reconciling them with efficacy, with strategic efficacy, efficiency, goal-oriented efficiency, basically. So you have to be strategic and principled. Because of that, we don't believe in very long lists of 100 companies that are involved in Israel's regime of oppression. There are probably hundreds of companies involved. But who can boycott hundreds of companies? It's unrealistic, and therefore it becomes ineffective, really. I mean, you'll have like 3 Che Guevaras in London who will probably be able to boycott all those companies. No one else would. No one else. So that's ineffective. So BDS focuses on impact, and to be impactful, we focus on a few companies, strategically selected companies that we have 4 criteria. Level of complicity. The deeper the complicity, the easier, the more compelling the case is to boycott the company, obviously. Like a company producing weapons for Israel, or company selling, I don't know, non-weapons, flowers to Israel, to settlements, still committing a crime, but they're flowers, they're not weapons. So clearly the weapons company would be a higher priority. Second, intersectional interest, cross-movement interest. So if a company is involved in violating Palestinian rights only, whereas another company is involved in violating Palestinian rights as well as child labor or women's rights or Black people's rights or any other racism, it makes sense to target the latter because it connects the struggles. It unites us in one struggle against this company. Third criterion is media appeal. if you have two companies just as complicit, one an unknown, obscure company, and the other a well-known brand, go after the well-known brand, because the media gets interested. If you're targeting an HP, Hewlett-Packard, or you're targeting Carrefour, a big supermarket chain, or you're targeting XYZ that no one has heard of. So that's the third criterion. The fourth and last criterion is potential for success. Many activists may forget that sometimes. A company is really nasty, horrible, we really should boycott it, but you have no potential for success because it's a monopoly, let's say. It dominates a certain market. There's no way, effectively. So we keep it on the shelf for a better day when we have enough power to go after it, when it's no longer a monopoly. But to sum up, BDS is about collective action, not individual action. If an individual decides to boycott those companies at the supermarket because they're really helping the occupation or the apartheid system, it's a nice gesture, but it won't cause any effect. But if that person organizes, so there is no one-stop shopping except call your near Palestine Solidarity Campaign branch, for example, your UCU branch, if you're an academic, your student union branch, if you're a student, and so on and so forth. Everyone might belong to an association. If you're not, just call PSC, Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and ask them, I want to do something for BDS. What are the context-sensitive campaigns we're doing in the UK? Because again, BDS is about context sensitivity. We don't boycott in Johannesburg the same things we boycott in London because they're very different. We don't divest from that company in Johannesburg or in Delhi as we divest in San Francisco. So the context matters. So the local organizations know best what to go after. PSC would know best what to target in the UK, be it Puma or be it Barclays Bank or be it this or that company. They would know best what works.
Thank you for that. I just have another question has come in on the Q&A. Do you think this Hamas attack will have a deleterious effect on finding a viable peace process in the Middle East?
Well, Palestinians are allergic to this peace process term because we've been having 30 plus years of a so-called peace process. And the only thing we saw was whatever is left of our homeland cut to pieces. That's the only peace we've seen. There's no peace without justice. So while under the guise of this peace process, under the cloak of this peace process, supposedly, Israel was eating up more and more land, expelling more and more people, incarcerating more and more political prisoners, injuring, killing, destroying, demolishing homes, demolishing ancient olive trees, and so on and so forth. What peace? So in that sense, the colonizers define peace as lack of resistance. The indigenous population, the colonized, the subjugated, the oppressed, define peace as the presence of justice. That's the only meaning of peace. As I said in my talk, if there is no oppression, you wouldn't have resistance. Believe me, even nonviolent resistance. I'm involved in the BDS movement. I would love to end my involvement in BDS and do something else in my life. Maybe work on Black justice, support BLM, for example, a cause that I feel very close to, or other just causes. I would love to end all involvement in BDS, but to do that, I would have to see an end to apartheid, to settler colonialism, so that I can enjoy freedom, justice, and equality like everyone else. My people can enjoy that. Now it sounds like a luxury when my people in Gaza, 2.3 million, are facing genocide. So we stop that. That's the most urgent issue. And then we talk about dismantling systems of oppression so that we can all live in freedom, justice, and equal rights.
Thank you. That's all the questions we have that have been asked. Penny, would you like to come in with another question? I understand that you have.
Yes, I'm interested, Omar, in what you think about legal approaches, international legal approaches to dealing with the question of genocide, settler colonialism, apartheid, and so on. I mean, our perspective at the International State Crime Initiative is very much to understand what is happening as a requiring political solutions, political and economic solutions, rather than legal solutions, because we know international law moves very slowly, that Israel has violated UN Security Council resolutions at least 28 times with no consequence. You know, that they've been able to violate international law with absolute impunity. And I wanted to hear your thoughts on that distinction between attempts by the very good UN Special Rapporteur at the moment, Francesca Albanese, but the whole approach to trying to use international law to progress the Palestinian cause for liberation and freedom, as against more political and economic strategies, which I put BDS under.
I don't see them as mutually exclusive. If we were to all invest our energies and human capacity in legal activism only, that would be counterproductive, because as you absolutely rightly said, and you know much more than I, obviously, on this issue, international law not just moves slowly, there's a hegemonic system in international law. Look at the ICC, the International Criminal Court. Almost all those prosecuted so far have been people of color, with 2 exceptions maybe. Since the court started, there are no war criminals in the White West. I mean, how come you just go after criminals who are brown or black? It doesn't make sense. What about George Bush and what he did in Iraq? What about Tony Blair and what he did in Iraq? Aren't they, you know, suspected war criminals that should be tried? No. So people in the global South see this international system as flawed, as rigged against us, as biased. But as I've always said, you have international law or the law of the jungle. As I said, this might makes right is horrible for everyone, because it's the most powerful that will destroy the rest of us. So international law was conceived out of the horrific genocide of the Holocaust and other massacres and genocide against people in Africa and the colonized states and so on. So we have something to work with. It is far from perfect. It's horribly biased. It's dominated by hegemonic powers, especially in the imperialist powers in the West. But we cannot give up on that, because otherwise we have nothing in common. We have no world system that can give us a semblance of justice. So at the United Nations, again, the General Assembly is not exactly that powerful, but it has symbolic power, some political power. When they voted 121 against 14, defeating the US-Israel genocidal axis, that was a huge political blow. If the ICC feels that type of pressure from tens and tens of states, especially in the global South and the more decent global North countries, that enough with this hypocrisy. With Ukraine, you jumped on the investigation of war crimes and so on, and now a televised, streamlined genocide, and you're not saying a word to deter it, let alone to hold criminals accountable. He's not even issuing a statement saying, Israel, look, some of what you're doing might be considered genocide, as so many genocide experts around the world, including some who are really the authorities on genocide, have said you're committing acts of genocide with intent, clear intent. If he just would utter those words, it could deter some of those crimes. It would save hundreds, maybe thousands of Palestinian lives. But he's that complicit. He's that completely dominated by those powers. So we need to fight within that system, but never invest all our energies in it, because if we don't have mass people power, there's no way the law will help us. The law is a tool, but we give it agency. Our power gives it agency to work for us or work against us. If we're not powerful, we don't have people power, the law will crush us. It will be used by the powerful to crush us, as it's always been used.
Thank you, Omar. I mean, that chimes very much with the perspective of the International State Crime Initiative and our own work at ISCI on genocide. Tom, are there any further questions, or is this a very powerful moment at which we might end?
No more questions.
Well, I'll take this opportunity now to thank you so much, Omar, for stepping outside of the horrors that the Palestinian people are currently experiencing, to address us here in England, to talk about how we address the complicity of our own government, and what we can do to help the Palestinian people, and especially at the moment, the people of Gaza. I think one of the things that we have to be wary of is that there is an absolute humanitarian crisis taking place in Gaza at the moment. But this happened with the Rohingya in Myanmar, and the framing of this problem as a humanitarian crisis can detract from the political nature of what is actually happening, that a genocide is happening, that it's the product of a settler colonial logic and an apartheid logic. So I think at this moment, we want to thank you so much for your contribution. And we hope that the audience, and I'm sure from the chat we've seen that people are incredibly appreciative of you taking the time to speak to us this evening. We stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people, and we wish the BDS success, every success, the BDS movement. So thank you so much, Penny. Omar, thank you. And thank you all for attending. We're very grateful that we managed to overcome the Eventbrite hurdle. And I think Eventbrite becomes one of those organizations, corporations that we also boycott. And we are attempting to use other platforms now at Queen Mary as a result. So Tom, Gulsh, and Omar in particular, thank you very, very much for a fantastic talk, and one that will, I think, inspire us all to do more.
Thanks.
Can I just ask if the panel can click on the link that I've just posted? So I should be there shortly.
Thank you, Gulsh.
Thank you.